Part 2 of The Puppets of Pandemonium and You Are Being Lied To, edited by Russ Kick. So the last sentence, but the pictures are what counts. No one registered the correction, and everyone remembered the mislabeled image. By sifting through tens of thousands of pages of information, including 10 years' worth of the New York Times and the Times of London, by digging up some very obscure books, and by working my way through a maze of little-known experts, I found that the Arab countries have a massive campaign of media and press manipulation at work in the United States. They've endowed university chairs from coast to coast to give academic credibility to their spokesman. One result, when the Ayatollah called for the death of Salman Rushdie in 1989, the head of the UCLA's Middle East Studies program, said he'd be happy to fire the gun himself. So the Middle East experts interviewed everywhere from the Washington Post to PBS NewsHour gave an increasing tendency to speak up on the Arab side, defending gross distortions as gospel truths. In addition, the Arabs pull strings in Washington through top-ranking firms like Bechtel and Aramco Bechtel. In fact, Bechtel, in fact, used its military contacts to obtain top-secret U.S. surveillance photos of Israelis' border deployments before the 1948 War of Liberation and passed them on to the Saudis. In addition, companies like Ford, General Electric, and numerous other lobbies woo the press actively on behalf of the Arabs under the umbrella of the Arab American Chamber of Commerce. Meanwhile, journalists like Hendrik Smith shout loudly about the Israeli lobby while pretending that an Arab lobby dwarfing in its size and resources does not exist. Until 1948, more Jews than Arabs lived in Baghdad, yet no reporter champions. Until 1948, more Jews than Arabs lived in Baghdad, yet no reporter champions the rights of Baghdad's Jewish refugees. Jews fled Arab countries in which their families had lived for centuries, sometimes for millennia, with only the clothing on their backs, yet the press never writes about them. And many of the Palestinian refugees the media are so concerned for are not Palestinians at all. The United Nations Relief and Works Agencies for Palestinian refugees in the Near East was long ago pressured into defining as Palestinian any Arab who had lived in Palestine for a minimum of 2 years. Yet the press had adopted the slogan, "Land for Peace. No Arab country has offered peace." Wrong. Yet the press has adopted the slogan, "No Arab country has offered peace." For decades, none talked seriously about stopping the boycott of Israel, which in terms of international law constituted an act of war. Few have offered to drop their official state of war against Israel, and none has ceased the rhetoric in its official newspapers calling for the annihilation of Israel, the genocidal destruction of Israel's citizens, and in some cases, the elimination of worldwide Jewry. Just as in the case of Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China, the media has chosen sides, and the side it likes the best is that of the mass murderers. In 1964, while writing a position paper on the Vietnam War for a congressional candidate in Buffalo, New York, I reviewed a tremendous percentage of the material being written on the subject at the time. Everything from articles in Time and Newsweek to the speeches of the president and his leading cabinet members. I turned vehemently against our participation in the bloodbath. It wasn't until 26 years later, while reading a novel by a South Korean who participated in the war, an author whose moral stance was neutral and whose work was published by a house whose owners were as much against the war as I had been, that I learned the Viet Cong had regularly enforced discipline in liberated villages by trying to that I learned the Viet Cong had regularly enforced discipline in liberated villages by tying recalcitrant families, men, women, and children, to kegs of dynamite and blowing them up in the town. In the town square as a lesson to anyone else who might disagree with the new form of Viet Cong freedom. Wow. Somehow, the American and French press, which I'd also followed fairly carefully, was diligent in its reporting of American atrocities. But the atrocities of the Viet Cong were airbrushed out of existence. And my impression these days is that the Viet Cong's outrages were the worst of the two. Print journalists have traditionally been accomplices in mass violence. Television journalists have gone a step further. They have been violence. Highly respected CBS reporter Daniel Shore, who started his career with Edward R. Murrow and reported on everything from the Soviets to the CIA to Watergate, confesses that most of us in television understood but did not like to think about it. The symbiotic relationship between our medium and violence. In the mid-1960s, covering urban unrest for CBS, I perceived that television placed a premium on violence and the threat of violence. I found that I was more likely to get on the CBS Evening News with a black militant talk